That's it for our reports. We are on to something now called council-initiated discussion. And for the new council members, this is an opportunity for you to bring things to our attention. You primarily serve as advisors to NHGRI, but you also represent the community. So if there are issues, challenges, problems that are percolating out there that you want to bring to our attention, or it's another opportunity for you to suggest or request reports, if not for the September council meeting, maybe sometime further out. So are there things you want to hear about or things that you want to bring to our attention? Mark.
So Steve's comment about Anvil and data stage kind of prompted this thought that a number of the institutes are developing their own data commons, right? So NCI, AID, NHLBI, and maybe this is more of a question, but I'm wondering to what extent the NHGRI is kind of involved or monitoring those projects and seeing to what extent they can leverage things for Anvil and other data commons like projects here, and avoid reinventing the wheel and take advantage of methods and tools that are being developed in some of the other data commons projects.
I see staff lunging for microphones.
Yes, we actually, NHGRI is actually very much engaged in those efforts. There's a Trans-NH effort in the OD level with Susan Gregaric as the interim director that leads a team of trying to identify what these Trans-NH resources will need for these different cloud platforms. Valentina Di Francesco is one of the members of NHGRI who's part of that group. In addition, each of the ICs like NCI, NHLBI, NHGRI is also involved in trying to identify areas where we can make our resources more interoperable, such as identifying ways that we can query our different data sets, agree on authorization and authentication for controlled access data sets. So those are conversations that we're actually having. So NHGRI is very much engaged in trying to make sure, to the best of our ability, that these resources are something that could be assessed across our different cloud resources. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
I mean, Mark, you very accurately point to an area where there is a lot of parallel activities, because I don't think there is a clear consensus on what's the best solution for a rapidly escalating problem. So there's not there's activity at the trans-NIH level, and then there's impatience at the individual institute levels, and that's why you see a bunch of parallel activities. There's the number of people, what Ken said is absolutely right in terms there's a lot of interaction and crosstalk because the bench is so small across the NIH of people who have this expertise that it's almost always the same, 10 to 20 people that are called in and to interact. So I think everybody's keeping probably not perfect communication, but pretty good communication across the institutes. Problem is to be honest with you, I don't think there's a single institute or a single NIH leader that really knows the perfect way to try to solve all of this. And so I think that's why there's a lot of, and maybe to some extent, I think Anvil we acknowledge is an experiment amongst other institute experiments, and we're prepared to modify it as we learn better ways of doing things. But it is on the list of things that personally it keeps me up at night. I'm very concerned about whether in the long run all these things are going to yield the best way that should be organized. But we are very receptive to external input, both at the institute level and at the highest trans-NIH level.
I have sort of a similar question, and maybe sort of similar, which is we talked a couple times about whether or not some of the commercial outfits, for example, the Ancestry thing, the 23andMe and so on, have a tremendous amount of data. And if you project yourself forward 5 or 10 years, I guess we still don't know where the bulk of the data will be coming from. And so I think it's it may be a broader question than between institutes. It may be, there may be a large opportunity to get in front of that and to provide some leadership where maybe some of the commercial activities, the data can actually be fed into the systems. So I bring this up just because we've talked about this a couple times about whether there would be a chance to get access into these data, whether the commercial outfits are even willing. But that might be a topic for a report in the future.
Just trying to think. I mean, access, more broader scientific community access to those data, or making sure those data are being mined for asking scientific questions?
Well, maybe both.
Well, I mean, an organization
but certainly as an asset to ask scientific questions.
Yeah, but
it would be the first priority.
Well, 23andMe gets grants from us, as an example. We've given, to ask very specific questions.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Ancestry's ever submitted anything, not that I know of, but I don't know. And the other trend, which you're probably familiar with, is this idea that it's fully anticipated that the bulk of genomic data is going to be generated as part of routine healthcare within 5 or 10 years. And that's a whole other set of circumstances where who's going to be the keeper and owner of those data.
And will there be access? What kind of access will there be? And so that's what I was actually suggesting is if you project forward in 5 or 10 years, where would we like to be? And are there things we could be doing now to try to secure some of that access?
So in terms of trying to stimulate that conversation around the council table, are you thinking a presentation from someone who's trying to access that data, free up that? In terms of, for some of this is what the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health is trying to do. So in terms of trying to get interoperable capabilities for sharing data from health systems around the world. But I'm not sure that's exactly what you're thinking.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I would ask some of the people that are working on, say, large-scale GWAS projects, for example. Would those data help at all? Are there large repositories of genotyping data? For example, at this point, down the road, there may be more sequencing data that comes out of some of the healthcare or pharmaceutical industry, for example.
Yes, of course, trying to integrate these many different data sources is a huge opportunity and a big challenge. And the consortium that we heard about earlier today of bringing together many different biobank projects is part of this. But yes, how to bring as much data as possible into the scope of academic research is a really important question.
One of the questions may be just to get a clearer idea about what the ambitions for some of these outfits are. For example, I'm not quite sure aside from the monetary ambitions, but in terms of technologies and so on, what is it that they're actually studying? What, the tools that they're using today actually compatible with some of the NIH-sponsored GWAS studies, for example? I don't know the answer to that. I hear a lot of talk that the activities in some of these outfits will be dwarfing, some of the maybe government-sponsored projects in the future. But I think there may be a question, is the tool that they're using right now, for example, compatible with the programs here? And so maybe, it's just a thought that if there really is that sort of data generation in the future and it becomes overwhelming, there could be a lot of value in getting access to the data. And it'd be nice to get in front of it so that we're not kind of playing catch up in the future, saying, well, why didn't we do this? There may be an opportunity to investigate that sooner. So I don't know, maybe there's, maybe we could have representatives from 1 or 2 of the outfits come and tell us about what they're going to do and what they see going forward, something like that.
Well, I was just going to say, perhaps relevant to the discussion, is that ClinGen's had an amazing buy-in from the, I should say, for-profit testing laboratories. They're the major contributors to ClinVar. They make up many of our committees. And I think it's a good example of where I think the laboratories that are actively participating would say they think it's been very useful for their own work, that it certainly helped patient care as the primary need or primary reason, but also that it has become seen as a good thing to be a contributor, and that is viewed in a positive light. So I think it's just the way to say that I think there are ways, because it certainly is not without expense. I'm sure it's with significant expense on their part, that there are ways to make the partnership work more successfully in some situations that we could look at for other NHGRI projects moving forward.
So a small problem, or at least easily fixable problem, I think, with huge consequences, the lack of standardization of what transcript is considered the canonical transcript to report a mutation. I really can't emphasize that the disconnect between different diagnostic labs, between Exact and Nomad, between various sources, the fact that there is no consensus, there is no imposed canonical transcript, is creating a lot of misinformation and poor counseling. So I think it's something that NHGRI could act on and make a big difference quickly.
A very different dimension, but I think some of you probably know that have been reading the lay press. There's likely, I think, to be one of the first big approvals in terms of gene therapy, but at quite great expense. It's still to be determined. This is for spinal muscular atrophy, exactly how this is going to be priced. But I do think a lot of people are looking at this for the future of this type of treatment. And to the extent that we have health economists that have thought about this and have tried to put this together, I think it would be helpful to inform how we look at this. And the lay public is, I would guess, going to have a strong reaction to this.
An optimistic reaction to it?
So in one way, it's remarkable that we will have treatments that, I won't use the word cure, but that will completely change the course of this otherwise fatal disease. But the costs that people are talking about are over $1 million for a treatment. It could be a one and done treatment, but it's a very different sort of way of costing this. And I do think it's going to have a strong effect in terms of, like I said, this type of gene therapy, gene replacement, other things. And so having some way of dealing with this on a larger scale, I think is going to be helpful.
Before you do that, can we go back to Hal's thing? I'm just trying to ponder what we possibly could do. I don't know if anybody has any thought, but the one that was occurred to me was, is this something that ClinGen has either thought about or would be appropriately situated to take this on?
Sharon could probably follow on with more details, but I have seen presentations. I think this is what you're referring to from the main project, where NCBI and EBI are getting together essentially to work on this specific problem. They held at the GA4GH meeting, they had a workshop to get input from the relevant stakeholders, and they keep iterating on coming up with the best approach to identify those canonical transcripts, especially getting input from the clinical stakeholders. So that is an ongoing project. We could potentially ask for an update. Do you remember the folks leading it? Joanna Morales, maybe?
Yeah, I will probably get the wrong names. And actually, maybe that's a good presentation for council. It's certainly an issue that comes up all the time in ClinGen. I have to be honest, I don't know how many people are actually listening that I try to avoid. It is technically extremely complicated, but very important. And so I haven't been as directly involved. There is definitely an effort between NCBI and EBI. And for example, just what you're talking about, the ClinGen allele registry is now changing and selecting a transcript so it's consistent with the transcript that ClinVar picks as one of the examples that goes to the top. So this issue is huge. The other not technical, but historical issue is there's so many documents in the literature for which you cannot tell what transcript was used. So you literally actually don't know what variant they're talking about. There could be an entire paper for which you actually can't be certain what variant they're referring to.
There are times when I have to click through every variant to go hunting for one that has a glutamine at position 304. It's just a huge waste of time. People end up saying, your variant is not in any population databases, and that adds weight that it might be pathogenic when, if you looked at the right transcript, it's common. But how much controversy do you think there'll be? Do you think people are gonna, fight for their transcript, or I think it probably would be a pretty easy issue?
It's definitely not an easy issue. Some groups really prefer to use, and sometimes there's not a clear answer, right? There can be two transcripts in two different tissues for which, depending on the disease, one of those transcripts is much more relevant than the other. And there are some of the transcript catalogs that really prefer to use the longest transcript, but that in fact might be a minor one. And so my sense of the discussions, again, I'm not playing any significant role at all, is that it really takes a bunch of people locked in a room for a couple of days more than once to at least try to come up with perhaps, and you may have to have, alternate A and B for some of these, but at least agree on what you're going to show and how you're going to define them, so we at least know what they all represent. But it's actually it's a very tough problem, but one that comes up quite a bit in ClinGen as being critical to try to solve.
So if we were going to have a presentation on this topic, I don't know, Sharon or Aaron, are there people that live and breathe this that can explain and help us think through this problem?
There are definitely people who live and breathe it. I'm not going to be able to give you a name
that's
today,
fine.
but
so,
yes.
Well, we may come back to you. And Aaron, we should be thinking about it. Well,
So
You can reach out to Heidi Ream. She's been helping organize some of these projects.
not sure that's on, but
There's a number of people that we can identify.
okay. Brian?
So as somebody that's worked on alternative splicing for 30 years, I could talk about this stuff, but
You were 10?
probably
Wow.
you probably wouldn't like my answer, is that I don't think there is such a thing as a canonical transcript, and I've never heard a satisfying definition of what it might be. And it's the first one and the longest one and the most abundant are not the answers.
Or the one that's asterisk, that is definitely not the answer. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting at, because I do think that it would also be useful, I think, and we can make sure, one of the things we can also do is facilitate some of these conversations as well. Mike Pazin and I were having a side discussion about GenCode and, how does the work that we do in GenCode and how well is that feeding in or not feeding into these discussions. But I think Brent did a better job than I would have done in highlighting those complexities.
And I can just add, Carolyn, that I pulled up the main project. So GenCode is a partner. NCBI RefSeq, GenCode, Ensemble. So there's a couple of groups that are working on it.
So as a user of public data for many years, developing methods and also helping biologists with their science, I could comfortably say that the most challenging part of dealing with public data is figuring out the metadata. And Brent's comments regarding how difficult it was to combine ENCODE and GTEX shows that this is maybe a bigger problem than I previously thought. We're very good, genomics has been very good at coming up with standards with a lot of people criticize them, but at least they're there, FASTQ, VCF, you name it. So given that ENCODE actually has a decent metadata, and so does GTEX. But given that you have gone through that experience, I wonder if NHGRI should take the lead on developing a standard for metadata. at least for genomics data. Because it would be, those of us that work with public data would be very grateful if there was something like that.
What would that mean in terms of the cost of a project, though? I mean, we pay people to generate sequence data, but to then maintain the metadata, I mean, would that be?
Not maintain it, but just have a format, a set of recommendations of what it should include, control vocabularies, requirements for the minimums that should be there, like say in an experiment where they compare treatment A to control, have a column that tells you which sample was treatment and which sample was control. That's not always there.
Okay.
We have folks at microphones, and I would like to hear, does that imply none of that is happening across our portfolio? I would be surprised, but go ahead.
Hello. So NHGRI does have a workshop that's actually, we're focusing on what's the minimum standards for metadata phenotypic information. We've convened a few times. We're just getting the ball rolling, trying to identify what that information would look like. And that's made up of different program directors and analysts here at NHGRI. So that is something that is going on. In addition, each program has their own definitions of what kind of metadata and phenotype data that they're looking for. But the goal is that information also will be fed to this group to help us develop some kind of guideline for what we're looking for in NHGRI. So
Recommendation would be to have people that analyze data involved in those groups.
that's a good idea. I think since we were starting out with just kind of like an environmental scan for NHGRI program officers, but that's a good idea to move forward once we've gotten past our initial assessment.
So in epigenomics and transcriptomics, a lot of that's been happening informally with big projects. We spend a lot of time trying to get in touch with each other. Roadmap Epigenomics from Common Fund got us all started on this path, and they've sunsetted, but the rest of us have kept the tradition going of talking to each other. None of us tells anybody else, this is the format you have to use, but we make what we're doing open, we share what we're doing. But one of the things that's come up is we continually face new challenges. Like one project will have a disease component that it didn't, another one didn't. So they have to change the format to add that. Or one project will have a temporal component that another one didn't. So they need to add fields to capture that. Or one project may have imaging, which the other groups didn't. And then, that brings with it new challenges. So I think it's been really fruitful that we've been working with each other and that we share these and that they're open standards.
I encourage you to come up with a format first draft. You put it out there and people start using it. There's nothing now. Like you said, you keep it amongst yourself. You don't share it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could do a better job sharing, but it is open. It's available to anybody. I think multiple projects have these things posted on their website, including ENCODE, including 4D Nucleome. Again, we're mindful of, as well-funded consortium projects, not wanting to tell individual investigator-initiated projects, you have to do this way because it's been decided by other people. So we're trying to hit that balance of saying this is what we do. We share it and it's available if you wish to use it, but we don't want to be in the position of dictating to others, this is what every project has to do and it's known with certainty, this is the best way to do it.
I wasn't advocating for forcing people to do anything, but if there's a standard that you give it your stamp of approval and it's 1, not 20, that might be helpful.
I would just add that International Human Epigenome Consortium, ENCODE is part of that. With ENCODE has come up with EpiShare. We're working through GA4GH as a driver project to come up with APIs, which among other things would consider what is the appropriate metadata that would be required for queries of epigenomic and transcriptomic data.
Last call. Certainly lots there to digest.
Can
Okay.
I ask one last thing? Are there any speakers in particular? There, as you heard in my director's report, there are, various new institute directors, various other folks, maybe even not so new, that you haven't heard from in terms of leadership from other parts of NIH. I didn't know if there was any particularly strong interest to hear about either. I actually was going to get Ned Sharpless to come speak as the new NCI director, but then he got whisked away to the FDA. So I was trying to line that up. But is there anybody, we keep an eye on this and anticipate what we think might be of interest, but is there anybody in particular, either who you haven't heard from lately or that is new in the scene that you particularly anxious? Rudy and I could try to get invited for either September or February.
So it might have been when the project first started, we had the All of Us update.
Eric Dishman.
Yeah. Now that they actually have a genomics plan, it might be good to get an update on that aspect of it.
Okay. And now that Josh Denny is on council, we could also lean on him to be a conduit to a lot of things going on with All of Us as well.
Wouldn't have to be Dishman.
But doesn't have to, yeah. And there's others that actually at All of Us. Okay. So we could queue that up for an appropriate upcoming council meeting.
Okay, home stretch then. So going back to the open session agenda, under announcements and items of interest, there is a report from the National Society of Genetic Counselors. And I think that represents their activities since the last council meeting. I refer that to your attention. And it's time now for me to read the conflict of interest form. This refers to the applications that you will be reviewing in the closed session. You must leave the room when applications submitted by your own organization are being individually discussed. In the case of state higher education or other systems with multiple campuses that are geographically separated, own organization is intended to mean the entire system, except where a determination has already been made that the components are separate organizations for the purpose of determining conflict of interest. You should avoid situations that could give rise to charges of conflict of interest, whether real or apparent. For example, you should not participate in the deliberations and actions on any application from or involving your spouse, child, a recent student, recent teacher, professional collaborator with whom you have worked closely, close personal friend, or scientist with whom you have had longstanding scientific or personal differences. The NHGRI staff will determine the appropriate action based on the recency, frequency, and strength of such associations or interests, either positive or negative, and will instruct you accordingly. In council actions in which you vote on a block of applications without discussing any individual ones, so-called on-block action, your vote will not apply to any application from any institution fulfilling the criteria noted above. Please sign the conflict of interest and disposal of confidential materials forms which are provided and leave them at your place. They'll be collected at the end of the meeting. So we have one more piece of business before we close the open session. We're approaching the summer months, and that means it's time for us to graduate another crop of program analysts that work in the extramural research program. Our analysts come to NHGRI most often for a 2-year tour of duty right after they graduate from college. And we beat them up enough before they decide that graduate school isn't such a bad deal after all. And they move on to the next stage in life. Program analysts actually do an awful lot of important work. And I think our program directors would be miserable without them. They really are, in many respects, the glue that's holding the operation together when your day involves 2 or 3 different phone calls. So when I call your name, this is the graduating class. Please stand so we can acknowledge you. Sheethal Joes. Robert Fulham. Let's do this en bloc, shall we? Robert Fulham, Gabe Botsley, Michael Pagan, and Michelle Cohen. Oh, there they are, hiding off in the corners. Yeah, come out from the podium there, Michael. There we go. So some are off to grad school, some are off to medical school, some are seeking post-bac research opportunities. Some are actually going for a job. God bless them. So now, once again, let's acknowledge them and wish them good luck in their future endeavors. And at the September meeting, I'll introduce you to the new cohort of program analysts, incomers. So that's it for the open session. Why don't you gavel us into the closed session?
And we will take a break now?
Yeah, we'll take 15 minutes, allow the IT people to come in and turn down the cameras. So let's reassemble at 10 to 3, please. Okay, thank you.